Can you all hear me if I don't use a mic? Can you hear me okay? Good, and I'll float down a little bit so you can. I want to thank y'all for being here. I applaud you for being here. I know I've been told that there are people both pro and against Common Core here, so whatever reason you came, whether to scope out the enemy or to hear a Common Core talk, I thank you for coming. I appreciate that. It's a very useful thing. I'm grateful to be here. It's my first trip to North Dakota. It's a lovely state, so I'm glad I got to be here. Before I begin my Common Core talk, I do like to give a couple disclaimers or make a couple statements about what's going to happen here. And this is an important one. I am no expert on North Dakota. So what I'm going to tell you here today, some of it may not apply to your state. Like, for instance, I know that North Dakota took no initial race to the top money. I understand that. So when I'm talking about here, please don't assume I'm talking about what you do. If you're a teacher, what you're doing in your classroom. Or if you're an administrator, what your school's doing, I have no idea. I have no idea what you're doing in your schools. I'm not pretending that I do. So I ask that I'm going to give you a broad overview of Common Core, and this is the 28th state I've given this talk. South Dakota will be 29 on Saturday. I've testified before 14 different state legislators, including my own in Wisconsin. I've also met with about almost 30 bishops about Common Core in Catholic schools, and well over 150 priests. So I've had a lot of experience talking about this broadly. Again, I repeat this to you, so please hear me. I am not saying any of this. I don't know what's happening in your specific schools. So I respectfully ask that you don't assume that I'm talking about you. I'm not making any assumptions. So I don't know, maybe in the question and answer period you can tell me. We'd love to know. I also like to say that Common Core, I find it to be an exceedingly bipartisan problem. In my state, Wisconsin, where Republicans control the governorship, the legislature, and the assembly, it's Republicans who have stonewalled efforts to reform Common Core. I also gave speeches about 3 weeks ago in New Jersey and Connecticut, and they had exactly the opposite situation. Democrats were in charge. So this is I don't see this as a Republican-Democrat issue at all. It's much bigger than that. So I wanted to say that. I also want to say at the outset here that this is not in any way, shape, or form intended to be an anti-teacher talk, an anti-principal talk, an anti-education talk. I have tremendous sympathy for the public schools of our country. And while it's absolutely true, there are many in the public schools that like Common Core, there are also many who don't. And regardless of whatever side of the issue you are on with Common Core, the fact is that nobody in our states really asked for this, nobody voted for it. Almost nobody was consulted on this, right? It became something. And let's take a show of hands here. Now that you're here today, Common Core has been in our schools more or less for 2 years, give or take, depending upon where you are. Quietly and gently at first, more aggressively now, you're beginning to see it. As you sit here today, may I ask, please raise your hand. How many of you, as you sit here today, consider yourself quite vague or fuzzy about what Common Core is? You're just not sure. Would everybody please look at that? That is a huge percentage of the room. And what I would like to say, that's where I want to start. Whatever you think of Common Core, it is absolutely true that it was not explained to us, that you got moms and dads and it's true of every audience I've given this talk to. I've given this speech to groups as small as 50, and a couple weeks ago in New York to a group of 1,200. And nobody knows. Nobody knows. Nobody can talk articulately about it. And yet here we are, and it's working its way through your schools. All right, 46 states currently, well, take it 45. Indiana backed out. 45 states in the union now have it. And nobody can explain how, well, I'll explain to you how it got here. But moms and dads were kind of snowballed by this, steamrolled by it. So I start with this question. If Common Core is so obviously and transparently good, why? Why the secrecy? Why? And when I say secrecy, that's a relative thing. The schools have been involved in it for a while, and they've been talking to the echelon on it. But you don't know. I mean, in an audience this big, the vast majority of you don't know. So that's the first place I want to start, right? There's a reason, I think, why you don't know. And it's something we're going to talk about in great detail today. Also, I want to say at the end of the talk, I'm going to put up a website. You don't get data mined. No one's going to track you on it. Put up a website, and you can go there, and you can get all this information. Anything I show you today, I will make sure I get it to you if you want it. And if there's something you can't get on the website and you want it, email me or go to the website and leave a message. My view of this is that you should not trust me. You don't know me, you shouldn't trust me. I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to show you where I get all this information from. You can have the information. And look, if you want the information, even if you're opposed to Common Core, you don't have to make up a fake website to get it. Just go ahead and email me, let me know where you're from, and I'll make sure you get the information, right? I'm happy to give it to you. I have nothing to hide. So you will get this whatever you want, and I urge you to please track it down and follow it for yourselves, okay? And if you have any questions or comments, or if you think you want me to elaborate, I'd be happy to do that, all right? So, and I would respectfully request that when you do that, when you do your due diligence and you track down the things that I'm telling you, and if you find that I am being true to you, then I beg you to hold the people who support Common Core to exactly the same standard. Make them show you what they claim. Again, part of the problem with Common Core is if they have been as upfront about this all along with you, you wouldn't be where you are now, right? And I wouldn't have to be away from my wife all this time giving these talks for which I do not get paid, just so we know. All right. Okay, so given that we're starting from a place of relative vagueness by your own admission, let's just start with what Common Core is. Common Core is an abbreviated term used to refer to the Common Core State Standards Initiative. Right now, it is a set of national curriculum standards for English and math with science guidelines and others forthcoming. All right, now that's interesting. They call it the Common Core State Standards. And that sort of leaves you with the impression that all these states had all this mega input, that this was a state-led initiative. Just not true. The standards were formulated, paid for, crafted, and validated before the states had any real look at them. And when you look at, there's no doubt that after the states took them and after they got filtered down, representatives from various states chimed in on them and they participated in this, but nothing got changed. This whole thing was done before any meaningful state participation happened. And so, you know, I guess kind of like the reason we call them state standards, right, is because when people hear that, they assume that, oh, well, this is a state-led initiative. Well, it really is not a state-led initiative. In fact, as we'll see in a few minutes, most states that took it didn't even see it when they accepted it, had not even seen it yet. And that's pretty staggering. So who do we get them from then? Well, these two organizations, the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers, they are responsible for crafting the standards. Now, when you hear the words National Governors Association, well, that sounds promising, right? 50 state governors locked in a room banging out education standards? But even then, that would be preferable to what we have. But even then, what qualifies our state governors to write educational standards? As one sitting governor in the NGA said, described the NGA as a meet and greet place for politicians and their aides to meet with lobbyists. These are effectively lobbyist groups. And the thing about these two organizations is they are utterly unaccountable to you, the taxpayer. You can't reach these people. If you dislike the standards they created, you can't touch them. And I want to start there because there are three parts to this talk. One is, how did we get here? That's the part that nobody ever wants to talk about. Everybody keeps insisting, let's just talk about the standards. No, no, no. It matters where they came from. It matters dramatically where they came from. The argument that you can divorce the standards from where they came from, or you can divorce the standards from how they got implemented, or you can divorce the standards from all the textbook companies who rush to fulfill the standards by producing curriculum and textbooks. The idea that these are all inseparable, it's just not plausible or feasible. And I'll show you why that is. So you got the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers. If you're checking me out here, and I hope you are taking notes, one person I want to refer you to is Joy Pullman. She's at the Heartland Institute out of Chicago. And Joy has written an absolutely definitive article that traces Common Core standards back to 5 people. Yes, down the line, yes, as it disseminated, yes, as the states took it, it broadens. But 5 people, 5 chief architects of Common Core associated with these two lobbyist groups. 5. And the lead, if you're doing your homework, the lead is David Coleman. Now that's somebody you just have to look up. Check out David Coleman's educational resume. I think it's going to shock you that the people most responsible for Common Core really don't have a whole lot of experience crafting educational standards on a national level. That's a complicated thing, right? To put together national education standards requires a lot of experience in that area. And almost nobody who did this had any. Let's start with Bill and Melinda Gates. Because it was the Gates Foundation that ponied up initially back in 2008 and 2009, $150 million to have these standards crafted behind closed doors. Money given to these two lobbyist groups initially. And as Bill Gates recently admitted about 2 weeks ago, in a big national article, to date, Bill and Melinda Gates have spent $2.5 billion promulgating, promoting, proselytizing for Common Core. Now, you've got to ask ourselves one question. Who authorizes them to do this? Why does a billionaire philanthropist and a handful of activists working for these two organizations, what qualifies them to create the standards that every single public school kid, or most public school kids, and many of our private school kids are going to have to learn under? What qualifies them to do that? And what kind of a system is it when this is completely not accountable to you or me or anybody else? That's a big problem. And we know, right? You understand that for all Bill Gates' millions, billions, there's no way he could have put this in your public schools or helped get it there. There's no way without the federal government intervening, right? I don't care how rich Bill Gates is. I don't care who these people, what lobbyists they are. There's no way this group of people could have made this the curriculum law of the land without the help of the federal government. This is a reality about Common Core that the proponents don't want to talk about. It required the federal government, through Race to the Top and among other things too, but Race to the Top initially. It required the federal government to get it into the states. So you can argue all you want that there's no federal tie or it's not ultimately a federal curriculum, but yeah, it is, and I'll tell you why. As of a 1965 federal statute, the federal government and the Department of Education, they are prohibited from creating national curriculum standards. Through a 1965 statute, the federal government cannot create a national curriculum. They're prohibited. So clearly, this is something that is desirable. So and if you look at the 5 people chiefly responsible for Common Core, these are people who are intimately associated with the current presidential administration and the Department of Education. Everybody at the top levels of Common Core are intimately involved, long history with the federal government, this federal government, and the people involved in it. So it seems to me it's pretty obvious what happened here. Because you understand that a federal government, as protective as this one is of its prerogatives, would not have allowed a crony capitalist and a handful of activists to craft a curriculum, curriculum standards without their assent and oversight and approval? No way. So what is Race to the Top? That's how the feds got it in most states. What is Race to the Top? Well, back in 08 and 09, when the president was stimulating things, right, like GM and the banks and all that stuff, he decided he wanted to stimulate education, too. Not, in theory, a bad proposition, but what the federal government did is they took initially $5.1 billion of taxpayer money, and they made it available through Race to the Top applications to any state that's wanted to apply. Now, some states applied and didn't get money right away. Other states won money at different rounds of this. Some states didn't take any Race to the Top money, right? But I would argue, and this is verifiably true in my own, Wisconsin didn't take Race to the Top money, yet we have a trail of hundreds of millions of dollars now that have come into Wisconsin simply by adopting it, even without taking Race to the Top money. And one of the biggest attractions of Common Core is not the money that's been spent so far, it's the promise of all this future money to come from the federal government to prop, support, nurture, and maintain it. That's the big appeal of this. So what happened back in 08 and 09? Through the Race to the Top program, the federal government offered states, through the application process, billions of dollars. To give you but one example, New York State received $700 million of Common Core money, $700 million. That's a lot of money for a struggling education budget. And when the application went out, it seemed like it was just a gift. But there was one proviso in the Race to the Top, that taking the Race to the Top money obligated you to adopt the Common Core standards when they were finally released. That's how most states in the Union got Common Core, sight unseen. And what staggers me is that there were states that didn't. 4 and 5 years ago, the feds basically say, here's hundreds of billions of dollars to split amongst yourselves. And all you have to do is adopt a set of curriculum standards that you haven't seen yet and that we haven't quite finished writing. That's how almost all the states that got it got on the hook for it. Now that's pretty staggering. You're basically bribing states to take a set of curriculum standards they haven't seen. But it gets even better than that, the Race to the Top application. How many of you remember No Child Left Behind? All right, good. Now, in the spirit of bipartisanship, what president gave us No Child Left Behind? Bush, right? And I'm sure you know, and Bush didn't write the education, No Child Left Behind. He farmed it out to who?
Oh my God.
Ted Kennedy wrote the education bill, No Child Left Behind. And it was a disaster. In all the talks I've given, maybe you'll be the first audience to illuminate me. In all the talks I've given and all the places I've been, I have yet to find a single teacher or principal or administrator who has anything but genuine contempt for No Child Left Behind. They really didn't like it, right? And what didn't they like about it? Well, they didn't like the high-stakes testing, and they didn't like the outcome-based education. And they didn't, a whole host of things. How many of you remember, by the way, what went on in North Carolina and Atlanta, Georgia, and New York all throughout 2006, 2007, dozens and dozens of school districts across the country, where teachers, even some principals and a superintendent, were taking the kids' standardized tests, dumping them in the garbage, and forging new ones? You remember that? Big scandal. Well, that's what you get when you get this high-stakes testing stuff, right? The argument of standards-based education. Let's go ahead and set an entire standard for the whole country in every subject. Right? And our job is to get all kids to that standard. How many of you have kids or grandkids? Just to say all of you. Can you get your son and your 2 daughters, can you get your 2 daughters and your 2 sons, can you get them to excel at exactly the same level or even close in all the different subjects? You can't? Well, if you can't do it, how are you going to do it with 60 million American school kids? And yet, for the past 40 years, that's exactly what we've been insisting upon doing. And as a simple exercise of common sense, if you're going to get, let alone 60 million, if you're going to get your 4 kids to relatively the same standards of education, ultimately, are you going to have to continue to raise the standards or lower them? It's common sense, isn't it? And that's exactly what happened with No Child Left Behind over its 12-year inception, right? Over and over again, they had to backpedal. And then you got the high-stakes testing. Well, if you got standards, particularly standards at that level, what's the only meaningful way you can measure whether your kids get to the standard? You got the tests, right? So if you're now, because of the, and let me defend teachers here as a lifelong teacher myself. If you can't get your 4 kids to the same place all the time, or even close sometimes, how are you going to expect a teacher who gets 30 new kids in a class every semester or every year, how are you going to expect that teacher to get all 30 of those kids within the same parameters? And tell that teacher that if they don't, their jobs potentially are on the line for it? That's not right. Do you understand why you get cheating going on? The stress of it all? And by the way, if you're a teacher and your career to some degree or other depends on how your kids do in the standards-based tests, what are you, if you're a smart teacher, going to teach to? It's common sense, isn't it? They act like this is some revelation, right? Or this is some kind of educational paradigm that's way too far above our pay grades. We can't figure the basic stuff out. So No Child Left Behind was a complete and utter disaster. To say nothing of the fact that why in the world would you need all your kids to be at the same place? Because you're going to have to sacrifice something, right? Every one of us are better in certain subjects than others. No one's saying, ignore the subjects you're not good at. No, work at them. But why not let kids go up and down depending upon what they're capable of? It's this regularization that's so frustrating. And then, if the only real serious mechanism you have to test them is the tests, then you become slaves to the tests, right? And the funny thing about this is this kind of education hasn't worked for 40 years. It has not worked. And yet, every time our kids get in a situation where it's not working, what is our response? The federal government's response. Well, let's just do more of it, more centralized, right? Well, I got to tell you, here's your first soundbite. Common Core is nothing but No Child Left Behind on steroids. Yeah. All the worst aspects of No Child, well, aren't they? All the worst aspects of No Child Left Behind are what Common Core is. You got the tests get even higher stakes, right? The accountability, right? The standards accountability. And what are your teachers going to have to teach to in Common Core? Because the only thing that matters now in terms of tracking these kids and data mining them and being able to keep tabs on them, you've got to get them to a certain level. So you got all the same, there are things that are different about Common Core. Let me ask you this. What was it that killed No Child Left Behind? What was it that killed it? Wasn't the federal government. What was it that killed No Child? It was working teachers in working classrooms. The big mistake No Child Left Behind made is that it allowed enough state and local control that you could get some resistance from the ground up. Teachers knew it didn't work. Moms and dads knew it didn't work. And there was enough groundswell ability here that Common Core died a slow death, but from the ground up. So here's the perfidy of Race to the Top. Not only did they bribe states to take sight unseen this stuff, but they also offered any state that took money a waiver from No Child Left Behind, only to mandate you take something that was exponentially the same but higher, worse. That's how they did it. You think about that for a second. When people ask you why the secrecy, why this, how did all this come to be? You go ahead and fact check this. This is how you got it. Not you guys. Remember, don't specify this to you. I don't know what your schools are doing. I'm simply telling you this is how the country got it. Most states in the union got it. how do we, as citizens in a democratic republic, how do we accept this? And now the people, and there's, by the way, there's your copyright. So the people who own this curriculum, these curriculum standards, they are utterly unaccountable to the public. That's the actual copyright. Let me read it for you. The NGA Center and the CCSSO shall be acknowledged as the sole owners and developers of the Common Core state standards, and no claims to the contrary shall be made. Is that like pulling the tag off a mattress? Because I'm about to make a claim to the contrary. Go ahead and arrest me, right? Selling snake oil, I believe, is the term, right? You take a look at this. That's your actual copyright. So the curriculum that is impacting all our kids, the standards, I should say, that are impacting all our kids, it's not owned by you and me. It's not owned by your schools, not owned by the teachers' unions or the Congress or the Senate. It's not even owned by the Department of Education. It's owned by a handful of activists and paid for by Bill Gates. So let me ask you a question. Do you think the people who support it so adamantly now would still support it if it was exactly the same set of standards? But instead of Bill and Melinda Gates, you had the Koch brothers, their billions behind it. And if instead of two left-leaning lobbyist groups, you had two right-leaning lobbyist groups. And instead of a very liberal president, you had a very conservative one who bribed states to take a set of standards that hadn't been written yet. Do you think the same people would be supporting it? See, I don't. And by the way, if it had happened that way, I'd be just as annoyed about it as I am now, if that's the way it happened. You understand what this means, right? And so the idea somehow, go ahead, Bill Gates, do whatever you want. Go ahead, but there's no way this gets into your schools. No way whatsoever if the feds don't make it happen. So we can pretend it's not a federal curriculum, and you can point to the nice little copyright and say, see, it's not. But there is nothing in the ability of these people to have made it your curriculum. Okay? And you know, I want to say this right now. There seems to be this perception that anybody who opposes Common Core, you know, I really do wish many of our schools would spend much more time just getting out and talking to you about this, and spend much less time simply trying to slander people who point these things out. I mean, I suppose it's a good thing. I've learned that again in Wisconsin. When your opponents have nothing else to do but call you names, when that's the arguments you get. When you get from your opponents cheap insults and character assassination, when you get that, you really know you're probably on the right side, however unpleasant it can be. But there's so many more productive ways, your school boards, that can be really helping you understand why this is such a wonderful thing. But I want to make it clear to you that this is not a right-wing kook lunatic fringe issue. There are 3 states in the union that have had Common Core a lot longer than your state. And they are New York, Florida, and Kentucky. These are 3 states where Common Core was rolled out significantly earlier than here. They were test states. And in these states, you've had 2 years of Common Core testing, and it's not been pretty. That's why, and you think about it, you got 1 blue state, 1 red state, and 1 purple state, Florida. In these states, Common Core's rollout has been an unmitigated disaster. And keep in mind that you really haven't had your first national Common Core test yet. That's when it's going to hit the fan. Right? Because that's when it hit the fan in those states. And so what happened? So New York, who took 700 million. Again, hardly no right-wing state. New York, the New York State Teachers Union. Can we all agree on that? That the New York State Teachers Union is not a bunch of tinfoil hat-wearing wingnut Republicans? The New York State Teachers Union, about 2 months ago, unanimously voted to halt the implementation of Common Core in the state of New York and called for the immediate firing of the Secretary of Education who brought Common Core to that state. Wow. Right now, as we speak, on behalf of New York, I thank you. I am this is a remarkable thing. This is the teachers union in New York. And one of the reasons they're doing this is because they've now seen 2 years of what the tests are like. And they've seen worse. What happens when the tests kick in? You think you have a lot of autonomy now. You think you can continue to amend and adapt Common Core and to mediate it somehow. Well, that's fine and dandy until you get the tests and you see what's on those tests. Then it's going to dawn on you really pretty quickly, right? And this is exactly what happened. I'm just telling you what the New York State Teachers Union said. This was their argument. Watch what happens. You got Florida now, right? Florida, after 2 disastrous test years, they killed off the park testing in the national park testing in the state of Florida. Kentucky's put a moratorium on any new standards coming into their state. because they're trying to get out of the ones they've got now. And these are the states that have had it longer than you. Oh, and by the way, this is fascinating. I'll show you the clip in a minute. Just today, the Chicago teachers' unions called for an immediate withdrawal from Common Core. Chicago. Now, you understand that that's a significant thing, right? This isn't President Obama's backyard. In fact, I just made a slide for you this morning. I'm going to show you in a moment exactly what Karen Lewis, the president of the Chicago's Teachers Union, said about Common Core. And so, by all means, you can try to make this about right-wingers or about personalities or about money-making schemes. But then if you're going to lump me in that category, then I really do hope you lump Karen Lewis in that category, the Teachers Union president of Chicago. And what a couple of bookends we'd make, because we both said exactly the same things about this. So ultimately, go a little bit further here. Oh, before I go on, so you got the New York, you got a big teachers union in California has rejected it. You've got the Chicago teachers unions rejecting it yesterday actually. You got the state of New York teachers unions wanting to pull out of it now, right? And you've got the NEA, the National Education Association, the nation's largest teachers union, who called a couple months ago the implementation of Common Core so absolutely botched that it had to be done again. Start over, scrap it, start over. Not the standards necessarily, but the whole thing had to be done and redone. And one of the reasons the NEA balked at it is precisely because of the absolute mishandling of this with you, not telling you any of this. That's the NEA. You know who else opposes Common Core? The Occupy Wall Street movement, right? There you go, more paragons of right-wingism. And why do they oppose it? They oppose it for all the crony capitalism behind it, right? Oh yes, Bill Gates is this wonderful, wonderful donor of all this. Isn't it great that we have billionaires willing to give back to the country? But you do know that, right? It's been estimated that almost 70% of American school districts will have to upgrade in some degree their computer capabilities to handle all this. Just out of curiosity, whose computers do you think are going to end up in those schools? You think? You think? And again, imagine if this were the Koch brothers instead of Bill Gates, right? I tell you, let me just start, without getting too carried away. Let me just ask you, do you think the federal government would have stood by, the Department of Education, President Obama, do you think they would have stood by and allowed the Koch brothers? Do you think Harry Reid, my God, his head would have exploded. Do you think they would have allowed the Koch brothers to buy a curriculum this way? Curriculum standards this way. Yeah, I mean, and what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If it's bad for them, then it's bad for us too, right? It's unacceptable. And let's go one step further. How about the Department of Education's two chief lawyers back in 2008, 2009? They both ended up not working at the Department of Education because they said this is a violation of 3 federal statutes. So in imposing the Common Core standards, and yet the second thing that makes it federal, besides the only way it got here was because of the federal government, then you've got the tests, the 2 testing consortiums, and all that information is going to go right back to the Department of Education. That's the other thing. You can look at all the copyrights you want, but those things happen. So in imposing the Common Core standards and the aligned assessments on the states, the federal government is violating 3 statutes and has put America on the road to a national curriculum. With respect to the Race to the Top Common Core scheme, Robert S. Eitel and Kent D. Talbert, former Deputy General Counsel and General Counsel, respectively, of the U.S. Department of Education, concluded that, quote, these standards and assessments will ultimately direct the course of elementary and secondary study in most states across the unions, the ones participating, running the risk that states become little more than administrative agents for a national K-12 program. And here's where we have to parallel this with Obamacare. And why do we do that? Because you need something on a similar scale. Under Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, states have to sign up for these exchanges. Some haven't. I'm glad my state, Wisconsin, won't do it. But some states have to, many states have done it. You set up these exchanges, right? What is the purpose of those state exchanges? Do these state exchanges offer you Ohio health care or Michigan health care? Or do they simply become administrative agents for whatever the federal program is? Right? You see what a tremendous loss of autonomy that becomes, right? Whatever state health agency you have now, it's at the whim of it simply administers the federal, it basically becomes a client or an outside contractor for the federal government. How is that not going to happen for education if this ever gets fully implemented? Right. And that's a big concern about Common Core, state and local control. Right. If the tests measure the standard, and the tests aren't in any way, shape, or form controlled by the states, but by the federal government at the highest levels, then what autonomy do you actually have? Right now in your schools, remember when I say yours, I don't, in most schools and states I've been to, if there's a book being taught in class that you don't want your kid to read, or a sexuality lesson that comes up you don't want them, or a movie doesn't want them to see, you can go to your teachers, in most states I've been to anyway, you can go to your teacher, you can opt your kid out, right? Or go to the principal, opt your kid out. Easy peasy, no problem. But if we get to the point where all of the subject matter becomes standard-based things that we test, how are you going to opt your kids out of that? Especially if it's standard-based. And that standard how do your teachers not teach something that's going to be on the standardized tests? And all of this, ultimately, the objective is, right? To be able to be taught at the standard level so it can be tested. So how do you opt your kids out of that? You go to your teacher, it's going to send you the principal, going to send you the superintendent, it's going to give you the 1-800-Arnie Duncan number at the Department of Education. Just out of curiosity, how much bad Muzak do you have to think you're going to listen to before you get Arnie on the phone? I mean, trying to bring a little levity to a disgusting situation, but again, why does local, state, and local control matter? Right? And why in the world are we eager to cede even this much of educational responsibilities to a federal government that has demonstrated no real ability to improve education standards going back 40 years? Why are we willing to do that? I mean, money's one reason. They go further a little bit, right? So they say that it runs the risk that states become little more, these were the guys on the inside working, that runs the risk that states become little more than administrative agents for a national K-12 program and raising a fundamental question about whether the department is exceeding its own statutory boundaries. They go on to say, the race to the top application, because there's your feds, right? The race to the top application, the initial vehicle through which Common Core was imposed on the states, it requires, now I want you to pay attention to this. You're going to say to me, and I'm going to agree with you, Common Core standards don't require any of this stuff. Of course they don't. Why do they need to? That race to the top application requires it. This is more proof that it's federal, right? If you took race to the top money, look at this is a direct quote from the race to the top application. It does not encourage me to recognize that the Common Core standards don't ask for these things. That is not a defense of Common Core. Because as we'll see as we move forward, we're already beginning to see how inseparable the federal government is to this plan, even though they've bought themselves some plausible deniability with that copyright. Couldn't have gotten in, couldn't have been useful, couldn't have been implemented without the feds, right? So they go on to say, the race to the top application, the initial vehicle through which Common Core was imposed on the states, it requires all applicants to adopt, a direct quote, a set of content standards that are substantially identical across all the states in the consortium. Now, this means that states, up to that point, have to adopt Common Core word for word. Now listen to this. The race to the top application says those states may supplement the standards, add additional ones, as long as, and this is a direct quote, they do not exceed 15% of the state's total standards. Now that seems awfully generous and a rebuke to our criticism of Common Core. See, they're awfully broad-minded. They're going to let every state in the union supplement Common Core up to 15%. But wait a second, ask yourself a question. Do you believe the federal government is going to create 50 different state tests? Because if they do that, you have no national standard, right? So if they're not going to give Ohio, who does something 15% different, and Wisconsin, who does something 15% different, or North Dakota, who does something 15% different, if they're not going to give different tests, how are they going to be able to account for all that 15%? Do you think it's ever going to appear on the tests? How can it? By all means, go ahead and supplement. This is what New York and Florida found out. They thought they could do that. And it turned out that none of that stuff appeared on any of their tests. So guess what the teachers had to do the next year? Drop the 15%, right? So, this language comes right from, and you can find race to the top. Just go find the application. You can read all this for yourself. Here's what I promised you. This is, notice the date, May 7, 2014. That was yesterday, right? Here's what Karen Lewis, the president of the Chicago Teachers Union, she said yesterday about Common Core. And the entire union voted overwhelmingly to remove Common Core. This is what she said. Quote, I agree with educators and parents from across the country. The Common Core mandate represents an overreach of federal power into personal privacy as well as into state educational autonomy. Common Core eliminates creativity in the classroom and impedes collaboration. We also know that high-stakes standardized testing is designed to rank and sort our children, and it contributes significantly to racial discrimination and the achievement gap among America's students. Take it up with the president of the Chicago School Teachers Union. That's a big statement. And if you please, as you're fact-checking me, look up her resume. This woman is to the left of Bill Ayers. This is not, I'm dead serious. You look her up. This is not in any way, shape, or form a right-wing issue. Right? And that was just yesterday. And more is a-coming. All right, so that's how we got it, ladies and gentlemen. Every debate, and I give, I don't know her, I give the superintendent of schools in North Dakota a lot of respect. After I did my radio show, she came on and she was very even-keeled. God bless, I just don't agree with her, but God bless her for doing it. But one of the things that she says is, I said on the radio, the Jay Thomas show, and I've heard this a lot from administrators, well, let's top all this other stuff and let's talk about the standards. I respectfully suggest to you that it's impossible to do that. You take these standards in a vacuum and pretend that they emanated out of thin air. No, it doesn't work that way. All right? The first part of this talk was about how we got it. And I respectfully submit to you that even if you think Common Core is great, there is no way to countenance the way we got it. There is no acceptable way to countenance this. It's not, this is Banana Republic stuff. It's unacceptable. Even if the standards turn out to be great, which I don't think they will. So part two of the talk are the actual standards. And you need one last little history lesson. After the initial group of people, relatively small, crafted and drafted the Common Core standards out, they did another thing that seems on the surface to be pretty useful. They called a committee together to validate the standards. Right? They called a committee together. They brought 29 people in whose job it was to assess the standards, and they were given the latitude to change or rewrite the standards if the standards were lacking. Now, the interesting thing about this, on the entire committee, they only brought in one expert in math and one expert in English. Right? One of each. They had some lower level people, but one actual, and they actually, in the application for the validation committee, they actually talk about their two experts, one in English and one in math. The math expert was a retired Stanford University math professor by the name of James Milgram, M-I-L-G-R-A-M. He's a heavy hitter. This is the guy that did most of the mathematical, or many of the mathematical calculations for the Apollo moonshot in the late 60s. He's a big deal. And the English language arts specialist was a woman by the name of Dr. Sandra Stotsky. She's one of the foremost ELA experts in the country. She's now retired herself and lives in Massachusetts. These were the two experts they brought in. Both of them voted no, and convinced other people on the committee to vote no. The only two experts in the subject area. Sandy says, and I quote, that Common Core English language arts standards will set our kids 2 years behind the 2 years they're already behind the rest of the world. And James Milgram said, and I'm quoting now, it's an absolute joke to think that Common Core math standards will prepare our kids for college-ready math or for STEM careers, science, technology, engineering, and math. These are the two people they brought in Common Core. Not only did they vote no, but they convinced 5 other people on the committee to vote no. Do you know, in the final validation committee report, their objections were written completely out, as if they never sat on the committee. And when I give you that website at the end, you don't have to take it from my website. You can find it online, too. But if you want it all in one clearinghouse, we've got Stotsky and Milgram's testimony in Wisconsin. When we brought them to Wisconsin to testify before the state on this. They know more about Common Core than anybody in this room, anybody in this state, because they were in the room. All these ridiculous, these claims, when I ask you to hold everybody as accountable as I ask you to hold me, you keep hearing that these standards are internationally benchmarked. Right? That we've internationally benchmarked them, that are all these countries that we've measured it with and we've adopted. Well, ask somebody, please, if they can provide you any mathematical analysis that shows that they did it. In our own DPI in Wisconsin, and Milgram talked about this, right? In our own DPI in Wisconsin has a list of all the countries that Common Core math has been measured against. So when Milgram was on the committee, he says, that's great, can I see the math? And for the entire time on the committee, nobody ever presented it to him. Nobody, not once ever. In fact, Sandy and Jim went out of their way to try to say, please show us any statistical analysis, any mathematical, any educational analysis you've done with any other high-achieving country. No documents to this date have ever been proven. Put them out there. If they're there, show us. The claim is absurd. Until they prove it, the claim is absurd. But it's easy to buy people off with that, right? Oh, these are internationally banned. Okay, good, great, how? Other than a list of countries, how? How have they been? It's one of the reasons Milgram wouldn't vote for them. You all know what STEM is, right? I think I mentioned it, science, technology, engineering, and math. Milgram's objections are pretty deep about this. Well, we'll get let me get there in a second. Let's start with English. I can speak very comfortably about English because as an English professor who actually has helped write some curriculum that was put in place in Texas back in the 2008s and 2009s, I think I feel comfortable enough to be able to discuss this. Well, Sandy, this is Sandy's chart. She gave a chart, presented it in Wisconsin about why she's so concerned. I might also point out that both Jim and Sandy are registered Democrats, just so we know this, okay? Here is what her concern is, that Common Core, the Common Core authorizes the removal of up to 50% of classic literature that you find in English classes to be replaced with or substituted with or supplemented with informational text. And see, here's a bit of a bait and switch too. Common Core English standards don't require anything be read or not read. I want to make that clear, so listen to me when I say that to you. The problem is, they don't require it, but what Common Core did is they created a list of exemplar texts, a list of books and documents that they say are Common Core approved. So you tell me what happened. When the publishing houses rushed in to supply the curriculum and the textbooks to go with the standards, what 450 texts do you think keep coming up in some way, shape, or form again and again in all those textbooks? It's the Common Core exemplars, right? In fact, I have not found I take it back. I have found a couple textbooks that are actually Common Core that include some material that's not exemplar. It's really hard to find Common Core English language arts books that include things that aren't on the approved list, and it makes sense, right? If you're doing the Common Core state standards and the Common Core state standards people recommend the following texts, it's pretty darn clear that that's what you're going to market it to, right? So that's how we got it. So Sandy's point is that what you're getting, and these informational texts, they're unbelievable. You're reading environmental protection agency pamphlets, you're reading President Obama's executive orders, and it's all coming from one way and one way only. They keep talking about how critical thinking bound Common Core is. It doesn't seem to me that if you're giving people ideological stuff all from one perspective, you're creating any kind of critical thinking, right? So Sandy's point is that what you get is much more indoctrination within texts and a lot less discussion of a character's morals and ethics. Why? Why is it that we teach kids how to read through stories? Why is it when you put your kids to bed? I mean, if the purpose of putting your kid to bed is to make them fall asleep, why wouldn't you read them a Bill Gates manual, a computer manual? I mean, if that's the objective, right? But you don't. In fact, many of the stories you read them, they excite them or they stimulate them, right? Why do we do that? Because kids learn how to read and read well and love to read by the engagement with characters and stories. Well, Common Core dramatically lowers that in favor of these informational texts, right? And so what else do you got here? Oh, another thing that Common Core does. We also know, and it's kind of common sense, as Sandy points out, that kids learn how to kids learn how to write well only after they really do learn how to read reasonably. When you sit down to study a foreign language, you don't start writing it, right? You have to start reading. You have to start get some syntax. You have to start get some vocabulary. Well, Common Core lowers the level of reading and radically ups the level of writing across the curriculum. They're writing more than they're reading in Common Core. And you got to ask yourself a question. What exactly is it that they're writing about if they're not reading all that deeply? And the answer is, it has to be whatever they're getting from the teachers, whatever they're getting in the lessons about what they're reading, particularly the informational texts. And so the other thing that's problematic about this, as Sandy points out, is by divorcing much of what they study in literature from our 2,000-year Judeo-Christian history, the Western world, or from 300 years of American literature that socializes kids and accommodates them to the American narrative, right? The American narrative of the slow, steady creep to liberty with all of its back steps and mistakes. Right? Now all of that stuff is being diffused so that there's no sense of cohesion. Here are just a couple of these informational texts. You can find them all online. Here are some of the informational texts. So in English class, for freshmen and sophomores, they're reading things like recommended levels of insulation. A report released in 2010 by the EPA and the U.S. Department of Energy. Now, whatever you say about that document, is that the kind of thing that's going to make your kids want to read more? Is that the kind of thing that's going to encourage that? How about, and I also guarantee you that in Common Core Science, as it's getting ready to be rolled out, and certainly in Common Core Math, they're not reading Moby Dick in those classes. So you're reading science, math, and tech subjects for grades 10 and 11. How about this one? President Obama's Executive Order 13423. Strengthening federal environmental, energy, and transportation management. Now, these are selections. Schools don't necessarily have to choose them. But I want to give you a slice of some of what the selections are. How about this one? The evolution of the grocery bag. It's a long essay. Spoiler alert, I know you want to run home and read it. Paper and plastic are both bad, and America's destroying the planet. I love the invasive plant inventory. It is exactly what it sounds like. It's an inventory of plant species that aren't native to this country, that have been introduced and are destroying other things. So plants are ruining the country now. So you can see, and this is the big thing Sandy was bothered by. She asked the question, Sandy, why is it, and she was on the committee watching this, she said, why is it that so much literature that's actually left in Common Core, by no means all of it, but a pretty steep percent, why is so much of it developmentally inappropriate, age inappropriate, graphically violent inappropriate, or downright sexually inappropriate? The most famous example that's been in dozens of states already is this one. This is Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. It's an exemplar text recommended for grade 11. It's already been taught in some schools as low as grade 8. This is a book, and Toni Morrison is a great novelist, African-American, Nobel Prize winner, but we would not assign this book to our freshmen in college. It's about, and you know, I should also say, this isn't so bad, but I will let everybody know, we got some young ones here. At the very end, there are a few things that are a little graphic, so I'll give you a heads up before it. The next slide, everything is blocked out, so you can assume what the words mean. But this book, it's about a 12-year-old girl who's a victim of rape and incest. And over the course of her abuse, she comes to bond with her rapist and writes an exceedingly graphic detail about their encounters. All the bad words are blocked out. I won't leave it up very long. But whenever I don't put it in, somebody just says bullshit. I don't believe you. So I apologize for that. You can see there, right? I'm not going to leave it up very long. And if you would like to see it afterwards, come on up and I'll show you. I don't want to leave it up there too long. It's really it's a great novel. She's a brilliant artist, but not for 11th graders, 10th. It's just not acceptable. And there's other books like Dreaming in Cuban. And there's other. How about did you see the father in New Hampshire who got arrested for protesting Common Core at a school board meeting? He was protesting one of these books that his middle school daughter was reading that was loaded with stuff, all right? Now, you can say all you want that that'll never happen in our schools, Dr. Pesta. Not here, not in North Dakota. Yeah, well, I would rather not have to police it that way, all right? And Sandy says, this is a direct quote from when she visited us in Wisconsin. She said, we need to explore why so many of these exemplars are out of place, not just in the subject area Common Core placed them, but in a high school curriculum altogether. What are they doing there? And even if you can finagle it so your school can avoid the worst of it, what does it say philosophically and pedagogically about the people who put it together? How do you unwrite that, right? That's the question. All right, Common Core Math, and I really do urge you you don't have to watch him in Wisconsin. You can see Jim Milgram. Just type in Jim Milgram. You can watch him testifying before dozens and dozens of states, right? This is the guy who was the math guy. Let me give you another name if you want to write this one down. The name is Jason Zimba, Z-I-M-B-A. Jason Zimba is recorded as the primary author of the Common Core State Math Standards, Jason Zimba. Milgram used to be his teacher. And Milgram says there's no way he has enough math to be able to do this. Also, Milgram points, and by the way, there's a recent essay, there's a recent article, you type his name and you'll find it. There's a recent article where Jason Zimba himself, I want you to go track this down. Jason Zimba himself admits that Common Core Math will not prepare kids for entry-level college math. He says that it will prepare them at best to begin 2-year technical college degrees. He says that, right? That's what Milgram confirms. So when I asked Jim, we talked about this, and other people have said the same thing. Well, then what's this all about? If they wouldn't show you how they benchmarked, what do you think the purpose of Common Core Math is? And he pointed us out to this video. It's a young woman, a community organizer from Chicago, who is talking to a group of Illinois high school teachers about philosophically what Common Core Math is. So let me just play it shortly. We can talk about it. What's going on there? All right, hang on.
They were able to explain.
Okay, there we go. Sorry, I had the volume down.
But even under the new Common Core, even if they said 3 times 4 was 11, if they were able to explain their reasoning and explain how they came up with their answer really in words and in oral explanations, and they showed it in the picture, but they just got the final number wrong, we're really more focusing on the how and the where did
And you can watch that clip too. In fairness, it goes on a little bit longer. And finally, somebody in the audience, one of the teachers says to her, but please tell us right answers do matter. And she says again what she said there, yes, but not as much as the process. And Milgram said that's it, that this is process math. That the purpose of this math is ultimately not to allow kids who can really excel in math, give them that opportunity, but to level math off to such a degree that anybody who tries it can be comfortable with a baseline math. In other words, as Milgram said, it's commune math. Right? If you look at the schools, if you look at the schools in places like Florida and New York that have been doing this, one of, not the only, but one of the preferred methods for teaching elementary kids math is the so-called pair and share program, where kids come to class and teachers don't really teach math at the board. They put kids in little groups of 2 and 3 and hand them problems. And the stated purpose of the assignment is not necessarily to get the right answer, but to agree amongst the kids what they believe the answer is. We've got papers. We've got moms and dads from New York emailing us tests and exams. We got one little kid in a 3rd grade class who the multiplication question was 6 times 7. He wrote 42. Got it marked wrong. And was told in red pencil that the other 2 kids in his group agreed on a different answer. They got it marked right. You had another little boy, and by the way, these are on the internet too. You had another little boy who had to do an addition problem, the answer of which was 111. He got it marked wrong because he had the temerity to write 111 and did not draw the 111 circles required for the answer. And you look, if you're paying any attention at all, every day there's a new one of these math questions that comes out, right? And you can say all you want, that that's the fault of the textbooks, Dr. Pesta. It's not the fault of Common Core. Well, that's only if you actually believe there's no connection, right? Right? A lot of people think that, or they want to think that because it makes it a lot easier, right, not to have to delve into this. But it's interesting that all the different Common Core, all across the states now, you're beginning to see these utterly absurd arguments. And I don't want to be glib here. Look, I understand that kids learn in different ways, and not every kid is going to learn the same way. So if there was some regularity to this, or if you could do traditional math, and then once you get that mastered, broaden out and do other things, that's a whole other issue here. That's not what we're talking about. And that's what Milgram says, too. Milgram also pointed to the second clip. He said there are thousands of these, Duke, but this is one, it's interesting to him because he happens to know the mother in question. All right, this is a mother, a highly professional mother, who can't help her 3rd grader with her math homework. So the mom puts the kid in front of the blackboard and says, do it the Common Core way. And so this is another short clip that I think is worth a moment or two to contemplate. There's the math problem. Basically, you're going to add 3 numbers, 15, 68, 1423, and 680.
So what I want you to do is, can you solve that problem showing me the way that you learned how to solve it in school? And task me while you're solving it.
She's a bit of a low talker. So a square corresponds to 100. All right, so if 100 is a square, then a cube is 1,000.
Oh, it's 2 squares.
That's 1,000. And now, we still have 500. Could we get back to 5?
Do you see how nobody's adding anything yet? This is just what you have to do to get the number on the board. The lines are 10s and the dots are 1s. So now you got to put the second number on the board.
Now we have to add all of 604. So now I'm going to write this down. So we have 1,000 plus, well, let's just say 3,000. 3,000 plus. So now we can erase all the sheets and hundreds of checks. We can just have that.
That problem you just solved took about 8 minutes.
It's about 8 minutes to do that math problem.
But at home, I'm taught how to stack.
And we're not allowed to do stacking math in classrooms, right? In every other state, I don't know about your state, in every other state I've been to, this is confirmed. They don't let the kids do stacking math. They don't let them do it. That's stacking math.
What are you thinking? You're looking at your problems.
So she gets 2 different answers.
You got 2 different answers.
She said, maybe I counted wrong.
The stacking correctly, and that took you about a minute. What do you think happened?
All right, good. You get it. Now let me be very frank with you. On behalf of struggling math students everywhere, I accept your applause. Let me be clear about this. A good teacher can make a lot of a bad pedagogy or curriculum. A bad teacher can screw up the best one. And I have no doubt that there are teachers who can do a good job of trying to make this work. The question is, look at me, I'll use myself as an example. For whatever reason, I had nothing to do with it. I was a slacker kid. But when I was in 3rd grade, they told me I could read at a college level. So in 3rd grade, they allowed me, it's probably why I entered the high finance world of English professor. They let me read books like Shakespeare and Dante and Aeschylus because I could. But in 3rd grade, my math skills were decidedly 2nd grade. And you know what? They still are. I mean, I can balance a checkbook, I can leave a tip, and that's the end of it. But so what? So what? You know, one of the problems with this is that we're beginning to create a situation where it is every bit as bad for kids to go above the standards as it is for them to fall behind them. Because there's no way to measure that. That skews the standard, right? And I'm going to show you something that I think is the most shocking thing I've shown you yet. And there's a couple dozen school districts that have stuff like this posted on their website. This comes from the Irvine Unified School District, the entire school district for Orange County, California. Well, what happened in California is you had a bunch of moms and dads, and this is well documented, who were getting very nervous because by 4th grade, their kids really could not add independently. And so they started getting tutors for their kids and having their kids work ahead in math. So the school district put up this on their website, threatening and warning parents not to do it. This is the actual thing. You can go find it. I haven't, this is about a month old. I have not checked in the last day or two, but it may or may not be up there. But this was, as of 4 days ago, still on the Irvine United School District webpage. It says, the links on this page are intended to support the classroom instruction that your child receives from his teacher. It is not appropriate to go ahead of classroom instruction or to use this site to have your child work on math for use in subsequent grade levels. There's your threat and here's your warning. Or backwards, there's your warning, here's your threat. Your child's math instruction and placement will not change as a result of working ahead. This means your child will continue to work in the grade level appropriate math materials regardless of what they do. You've got schools now telling kids, no matter what math they do, they're not moving forward. No matter what math they do, their placement stays here because it screws up the system. You know, there's something, as Milgram, when I told Milgram the story of my 3rd grade experiences, he said, well, you're the problem, Pesta. You're a slacker in math, and you skew the standards in high school. And he said to me, and he's right, he said, don't you see how terribly unfair it was, Dr. Pesta, for you to have been given a gift that other kids didn't have? We have to mitigate those gifts now, right? What we want is a curriculum that lowers things so that everyone's comfortable, no one's left behind, but what this does is, right, and what we're seeing is a lot of kids who are really math gifted are just pulling their hair out over this stuff. And this, you don't even have to take my word for it, just take a look and see. Moms and dads, kids banging their heads against walls, kids not wanting to go to school, and I'll show you examples of that before we're done. But this kind of blows me away, that we've reached the point where you have school districts threatening kids about where they're going to be and what they can and can't do. It's really kind of shocking. All right, oh yeah, you can get all this information from me later. I'm not going to spend much time on it. One of the big, I will talk about it. One of the big aspects of Common Core fear is the data mining, is all of the information they want to begin to gather on kids. And by the way, please go look at the Race to the Top application. Because right in the Race to the Top application, one of the things that also stipulates that by buying into Common Core through Race to the Top, you have an obligation to report certain data to the federal government. That's just obligated. In my state, Wisconsin, which again, remember, is run by Republicans, in my state of Wisconsin, just 1.5 months ago, the state legislature set aside $7.1 million of Wisconsin money to now begin the process of data mining Wisconsin school kids. And more Republicans voted for it than Democrats. So bipartisan, right? And that's Scott Walker's state. So this idea, and one of the arguments is because we're doing Common Core, we have to report this data to the feds now. It's mandatory. And if you look, I've got it highlighted, but you really can't read it. It's easy enough to find. And you don't have to find it from me. You can find this all over the place. You remember that 27,000-page Obamacare document that Nancy Pelosi said we had to pass before we know what's in it? Well, we know now. And there are all sorts of places in the document that authorize the schools to become data and information gathering places in the name of health. That's one of the nice things when things get federalized. When healthcare is now a federal issue, everything now is healthcare, right? Everything. Big gulps in New York, 32-ounce sodas in New York have to go. How about the way they're using the healthcare legislation to try to get at guns now? They couldn't get at them other ways. It's a health problem, guns, right? And I got to tell you, when this goes if Common Core does end up going that way, gets fully implemented this way, how can it be any different? You know, there are 24 schools across, they're starting to build new schools. There's 24 of them already in construction. When they're building new schools at the middle school and high school level, they're starting to build them with pharmacies attached. Well, you do know, right? This is, and what I'm telling you right now is not Common Core's fault, but I think it's important that you know where the data mining is going to come from. You know that under Obamacare, the schools are rapidly being authorized to be able to provide birth control and in some instances even abortions to your children without necessarily consulting you, and will be paid for. That's part of the Obamacare legislation. And you think about it, you're going to give a young girl, a 13, a 15-year-old girl who goes to the school and says she's pregnant, she's got a problem. You want to give her the morning after abortion pill. It's awfully embarrassing to take her off campus and drive her over to the Planned Parenthood office. So one of the rationales for this, it's a healthcare overlap, right? That we need to be ready in the schools to be able to, and these are the same schools, by the way, where if your daughter shows up with a Midol, right, she's suspended for a week, right? Yeah, the whole thing is kind of screwy. You can get all this on your own. That, by the way, is the building. That's the building the feds just finished in Utah last year, right? Multi-billion-dollar facility. That's where they want to store most of the data they begin to collect. Not just on your kids, but certainly that. This is the one that the Utah State Legislature is trying to cut off the water rights to, right? They're trying to figure out how they can do this. That's the other thing. It may not be a national curriculum, and you want to know why it's not a national curriculum? Because you saw the copyright. It says it's not. Well, that's good enough for us, right? But you ask yourself, why is the federal government, for the last 2 years, the Department of Education, why have they been writing parallel curriculum to Common Core, things that support and prop and help ease its transition? This is just one of those documents. And you can see from the title on the document, February 2013, it was only written last year. And you can find this online. And if, first of all, before we move off this, I want you to pay attention to the title. This is their attitude towards your kids' education. This is how critical factors for success, it's an education tract. Critical factors for educational success in the 21st century. Their view of it is grit, tenacity, and perseverance. That's what education is. When I hear the word grit, I imagine John Wayne getting a bullet dug out of his thigh. It's something, this perseverance, right? Just tenacious like a tick. Just try to suffer through it. Is that the vision of education you have for your children? But do you understand with everything you've seen so far, the drone-like nature of all of this? Do you understand why they're turning education into that? It's not an awakening. It's not an efflorescence. It's not kids finding out who they're supposed to be. This is something you just got to suck it up and get through so you can get into the workforce. And if you go to page 43 of this document, you see these. These are the implements that they want to use not simply to ask your kids questions, but to biologically meter your kids, to measure how your kids are reacting physiologically to the questions that they ask them. And by the way, every one of these things is in one of those 3 states. Not one of those things is in Wisconsin, as far as I know. But then again, it was just last month we set $7 million aside. And by the way, if all this is asking your kids questions about certain things, why in the world do you need $7 million to do that? My favorite is the one on the extreme right. It's basically a blood pressure cuff that goes around the bicep, but they've modified it for kids, technology, right? Better living through chemistry. They've modified it for your kids. And you put it around the wrist, and it does the things you would expect, heart rate, pulse rate, that sort of thing. We have one little girl in New York who came home with a big angry bruise last year. And mom would not have known, asked her, what happened to you? Oh, Mom, they brought me into a room, the school nurse and one of the assistant principals, and they put that on her wrist, and they asked her a couple hundred questions, she said, including, and there's a detailed list of them, including questions like, do your parents vote? Did they vote in the last election? Who did they vote for in the last election? Are there guns in your house? Would you feel more comfortable if somebody from the school came and took your guns away? Are your parents divorced? This little girl's parents were. Would you feel better if the school helped you live with the parent of your choosing? She said hundreds, who knows? But there was a long list of the ones that she remembered, right? And that's one of the reasons New York's pulling out, by the way, because this went viral and lots of other moms and dads had the same thing happen to their kids. That's why liberal New York is getting skitsy about this. And you've got things like the pressure mouse, right? Do certain topics or themes or subjects cause your kids' hands to sweat more? Or the posture analysis seat, right? Do they slink and do they slouch at certain topics or themes? The facial expression camera is a good one. Some schools are passing out as school supplies state laptop computers. This happened in Pennsylvania, where moms and dads showed up the first day of class in a high school district, and they were all given state computers. And then moms and dads in a public school were charged $650 for the use of those computers. They could not use their own. And all of them had facial recognition cameras in them, which means when you opened the laptop and you turned it on, the little camera in this immediately started recording. So whenever that laptop was turned on, whoever was in front of it or whoever was watching it was getting recorded. Now, look. This is like the NSA, right? They're collecting all this data, but there's nobody sitting, God, I hope not, at the Department of Education watching it's not. But if there's ever a problem, this all gets dumped into your kid's file, right? And if there's ever a problem, they can go back in and they can piece together, and keystroke recognition. Every single key that's ever hit on those computers becomes part of the data gathering log. Oh, and this has really evolved already well beyond those 3 states. Pennsylvania with the facial camera, California's got this stuff. It's already moving. And again, when Wisconsin sets aside $7.1 million, again, if it's just simply asking questions, it doesn't make sense. Well, yeah, and so that's all right, so that's sort of the second part. We're now kind of into the third part. The third part is, and I want you to listen to me carefully, please. This stuff is intimately, whenever you get something as big as Common Core, just like whenever you get something as big as Obamacare, you recognize, right, that it doesn't just come in a neat little box. There are all sorts of arms and tentacles and other things associated with it, right? That's common sense. So I'm going to try to, and I want you to listen to me, please. I'm going to be very specific about what we know about Common Core and these things and what we don't. So please listen carefully. I want to start with this. I want you to pay attention to the document title. You can find it online. It was released in September of 2012. Now look at the title of that document. These are the National Sexuality Education Standards. What does national suggest to you? And if they're standards, that means at some point they're going to have to be what? Tested. All right, good, you're with me. And take a look at the subtitle of that document. This is Core Content and Skills, starting in kindergarten. What do you think core content alludes to? Now, I understand the word common's not up there, so I'm just being an alarmist now. But lest you think I am just being an alarmist, turn to page 6 of that document, and you'll see this. The national sexuality standards were informed, further informed. In other words, when they wrote them, they based some of what they wrote on all those things. The Center for Disease Control. Take a look at the last one on the list. Common Core standards for English language arts and mathematics. What in the world are the national sexuality standards consulting English and math pedagogy for? It's right there in the document, which calls itself core content. I mean, do with that what you will. Call me crazy. But it's a problem. Why are the sexuality writing people at the Department of Health, the Department of Education, why are they informing what they do by what goes on in Remember that question I left hanging, that Sandy left hanging? Why is there so much sex and inappropriate stuff? And do you think this has anything to do with it? Because the national sexuality standards. Oh yeah, and that's a good point. It's going to be a little rough for the next couple minutes in terms of some graphic things I'm going to show you. We're not quite there yet. I just want everybody to know in case moms and dads want to make their own decisions about things. So the national sexuality standards, all right, this curriculum, which in most states actually sort of predates Common Core or is coterminous with the beginning of it. That doesn't make any sense. It came in right when Common Core was coming in. These standards, and the remarkable thing about them, is that they were never meant to be rolled out as a separate aspect of the curriculum you could vote on or not vote on. Unlike Common Core English standards and Common Core math standards, which everybody got to see, these aren't that way. These were written to be folded into every other aspect of the curriculum, and they already are being folded in, and I'll show you that in a minute. It's pretty shocking. So what the national sexuality standards do, so I'm not going to call them Common Core. I'm going to call them core because they left the word common off. But you see what they're telling you right here. These standards, they break your kids up into 3-year cycles. 5, 6, and 7-year-olds. 8, 9, and 10-year-olds. 11, 12, and 13-year-olds. That's it. How many of you teach your 5-year-olds about sex? Well, you know they're gonna now, right? In the public schools. That's already here. In Wisconsin, I got blasted by a DPI. DPI is different, I suppose, in Wisconsin than North Dakota. But I got blasted by a DPI guy for pointing this out in Wisconsin about 2 weeks ago. He said, this is all ludicrous and absurd. We also heard that here in North Dakota, so I feel comfortable. It's a good welcome home for me. And yet, we actually produced the document and sent it to him. He's a DPI spokesman. A year ago in July of 2013, the Wisconsin DPI held a public school teacher conference at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, and the entire agenda of that conference was implementing these standards into Common Core. With 1 year from the date he called me ridiculous for bringing this up, he said it would never be in Wisconsin schools. His own DPI held and sponsored a seminar for public school teachers on how to incorporate this into Common Core standards. And I'll show you that document if you want to see it. He was not amused when I sent it to him. He didn't write me back. So here are the standards. I'm just going to give you a slice of them. Go look for it goes on for 40 pages, this document. Here's what they're going to do with 5, 6, and 7-year-olds. Here's the standards they want those kids to meet. So by the end of 2nd grade, by the time your kids are 7, students should be able to identify different kinds of family structures and demonstrate ways to show respect for different types of families. Innocuous enough. We want kids to be respectful. But who gets to decide what respect means? And so, what if you come from a devout Christian home or an Orthodox Jewish home or a Quranic Muslim home? What does showing respect for certain kinds of marriage mean? And why in the world are you burdening 5 and 6-year-olds with this? You understand, right? That 5 and 6-year-olds are developmentally incapable of really processing this stuff. So what is the only reason you would do this to kids that young? It's not to teach them something. It's to imprint it on them, right? And do you understand? I'm going to tell you flat out, I don't think it's the federal government's, the public school's business to be teaching your kids sex. I don't. I realize that makes me an extremist, but let's even grant that you believe that the public schools are absolutely responsible for teaching your kids the birds and the bees and how to protect themselves sexually. I'll grant you that maybe that's okay. Do you understand that nothing I'm going to show you has anything to do with any of this? This is strict sociology. They're not worried about pregnancy. They're not worried about birth control. They're not worried about sperm and egg. This is simply, at kids, starting with kids as young as 5, programming them to think certain ways about topics that really are the purview of mom and dad. I said before, if you ask me in a nutshell the biggest problem with Common Core, it's not necessarily the way they teach the 1, 2, 3s and the ABCs. I have no doubt that for some states, Common Core will mark a slight improvement. For others, it will be a big step down. And it depends on how you implement it. Depends on what your teachers are doing with it. I get that. But the problem is not that. The problem is all the sociological stuff that's wound up in every aspect of Common Core, including math, in the way questions are asked, in the way questions are framed. You've all seen the assignments, right? It's like the Common Core English assignment that was sent home to 6th graders in Wisconsin, made the viral news. Write an essay on how the state is just like the family, but better. That was the essay title. Yep. And you see these, and of course people will say, well, that's just bad teaching, that's just bad textbooks, Dr. Pesta. And I am respectfully telling you, there is no way to separate the feds, the textbooks, that ginned up and provided the curriculum and the pedagogy for it, and the standards. This is the kind of stuff we're talking about here. This, as you just saw, this is meant to be incorporated into these subject areas. Because, look, we don't take 5-year-olds and put them in health class. We don't take your 6-year-olds and put them in biology and health seminars. We don't do it. How are they going to get the kids to this stuff? They're going to have to make it a part of all the outstanding curriculum. How about this for 5 and 6 and 7-year-olds? Describe differences and similarities in how boys and girls may be expected to act. Because, you know, if numbers aren't true or false, then neither is gender in biology. Gender is a cultural construct. Right? Simple biology doesn't exist anymore, right? And look at this bottom one here, by the time they're 7. Again, I would not ask this to sophomores in college because it's just so ridiculously, absurdly broad. You're going to have a 7-year-old, a 6-year-old, provide examples of how family, friends, media, society, and culture influence ways boys and girls think they should act. So you're going to send your kid to the internet with a sex and gender search? How in the world does a 7-year-old get that information unless it's being implanted in them? Look, and don't get me wrong, on the whole homosexuality issue, I'm so tired of it. I'm agnostic. I really don't care. I honestly don't care one way or the other. But I do care about this. I believe it is your job as Americans to teach your kids your views of sexuality. It's your responsibility, right? And you think about this, by the way, too, and if this all becomes standard stuff, if you have a moral objection or a political objection or you insist on teaching them a different way, what's going to happen when your kids bump into the standards here? Do you see what this might potentially unleash? In the worst case scenario, yeah. I mean, somebody's abusing those kids. They're teaching them one sociological aspect towards sex. You're teaching them a different one. Someone's doing it wrong. This is a very, very dangerous slope. How about this? By the time they're 10, this one kills me. Before kids have hit puberty, you're going to tell them how socially and emotionally they should react to it. That's outstanding. Explain the physical, social, and emotional changes. How do you explain an emotional change to somebody who hasn't gone through it yet? And what are you trying to accomplish? Explain the physical, social, and emotional changes that occur during puberty and adolescence, and of course, again, for 9 and 10-year-olds. Describe how friends, family, media, that's also, do you notice what you don't see here is any biology? Notice what you don't see here is any condoms or birth control. What you're seeing here is flat out sociological experimentation on your kids. And I don't know if I remember if I told this to you yet. I told somebody else. I don't remember. If I'm repeating myself, I apologize. Please go look at Bill Gates' statement in September in the Washington Post. Not 6 months ago. Bill Gates said publicly, on record, quote, "It will be nice to know if our education stuff is going to work, but we won't know for at least 10 years. Bill Gates. This is guinea pig stuff, people. You want to know why they can't prove it's been benchmarked? Because they don't know if this is going to work. They don't know, right? Okay, how about this? By the time they're in 5th grade, 10 years old, here's the standard. Your kids will define sexual orientation as the romantic attraction of an individual to someone of the same gender or someone of a different gender. That's the standard. Do they get to make that decision for your kids at 10? All this stuff comes right from the document. Go look it up for yourself. And even better than this is how they're going to teach this to your kids. And you do get what I'm telling you. If you're going to start kids off with this stuff at age 5, you cannot do it any other way but then making it a part of all their other subject matter. So what are they going to do? Here you go, right from the document. Well, what's required? Well, instruction by qualified sexuality education teachers is essential for student achievement. How about this? Students need opportunities to engage in cooperative and active learning strategies with regards to the standards. How about this? Sufficient time must be allocated for students to practice skills relating to sexuality education. And how about this? Students need multiple opportunities and a variety of assessment strategies to determine their achievement of the sexuality education standards and performance. You please remember what I told you. I am not saying this is Common Core. But Common Core is clearly the vehicle through which this comes. You saw the place on the document where Common Core English and Math inform the standards. How else are they going to teach this to your kids? What is the mechanism? How do you separate all this stuff out and call this crazy? Oh, sorry, doggone it. Yeah, this is pretty shocking. This is probably the most shocking thing. Well, one of them I'm going to show you. I think we're okay now. Look, I apologize for this, but I want to give you a sense that this is already in your schools. The poster that I'm about to show you hangs at the front of the classroom in a middle school in Shawnee, Kansas. We're not talking hippy-dippy Madison, Wisconsin, or even Berkeley, California. We're talking the middle of the Bible Belt in Shawnee, Kansas. The poster I'm about to show you to this day hangs in the middle school. It was a 6th grade girl who took the picture and brought it home to Dad. This is the poster that hangs at the front of the classroom. It's graphic. The title of the poster is, How Do People Express Their Sexual Feelings? Now, this to me is a perfect microcosm of Common Core, because they clearly aren't concerned about spelling because they spelled caressing wrong. You've been caressed lately, ladies? And they're clearly not concerned about simple things like proofreading because they put talking up there twice, right? But now look at this. I want you to see this. All these are ways people express their sexual feelings. Talking, saying, did you know saying I like you is sexual? I like you. Now, you're going to sue me for harassment, right? It doesn't make any sense. But look, along with those things, talking and caressing and saying I like you, I'm not going to read some of the other ones. Here's my philosophical question. For a public school system obsessed with birth control to the point of fetishization, don't you think it's odd that there's not the slightest suggestion that certain acts on that board, that poster, are more dangerous than others or might lead to pregnancy? You know what that is? That's more pure sociology. What that is everything on that board is equally acceptable. If you reject one thing, you reject them all. They're all perfectly legitimate ways. This is unbelievable for 7th and 6th graders. So Dad predictably freaked out, right? And even more shocking than the poster is the response Dad got the next day. All right? Here's the response from Hocker Grove Middle School spokeswoman Leanne Neal of Shawnee, Kansas. The poster that you reference is actually part of our middle school health and science curriculum. And as such, it is part of our district-approved curriculum. Where did it come from? The curriculum it is a part of aligns with the national standards on these issues. And it stays put, and it's still there today, right? And that's Kansas. And as Sandy Stotsky points out, that's why. That's why. And it's not just sex. That's why we have one little 3rd grade class in Wisconsin who read 40 pages of dystopian literature in 3rd grade class, all about the end of the world, destruction, cannibalism, people eating each other to survive. 40 pages of this. The mom was absolutely livid furious, right? Why are we doing this to kids at young ages? I'll go one step further here. I'm sure many of you have seen this book. Yes. Now listen to me when I tell you this. This book predates Common Core. It was written in the late 1990s. However, certainly in Wisconsin and other states I've been to, the latest versions published in the last 2 years are all stamped in red on the inside cover, Common Core approved. This book it's perfectly normal. It's all about teaching 4th graders how to masturbate. And so when you open the book, you see this. It's just what you saw in the poster. It's just naked people. And you notice how inclusive it is. You've got fat naked people, skinny naked people, tall naked people, short naked people, black naked people, white naked people, Hispanic naked, you got handicapped naked people, and I don't know how they get this one by the child porn people. You got little tiny baby naked people, right? But you see what the implication is, right? The implication here is that, just like with the poster, it's perfectly normal. Get used to it. There's nothing untoward about this at all. And then you actually go on to images like this, pictures of teaching little kids, showing kids how to pleasure themselves. It's interesting. The version of this book that was donated to the Milwaukee Public Library was donated by the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. Right, the newspaper donated this to the public library. Yeah. All right, we're almost done. We're almost done. I've got one more thing to show you. Not surprisingly, if you've been paying attention to Common Core and its implementation, there are all sorts of trauma happening out there. Trauma for parents, trauma for kids. The establishment wants you to believe it's trauma because we now have serious standards and these, well, remember what Arnie Duncan said? Remember what Arnie Duncan said about all the plaints about Common Core? It's just a bunch of white suburban moms playing the race card. Just a bunch of white suburban moms who can't handle the fact that their kids aren't as smart as they thought they were. That's your Secretary of Education, right? But there's been a lot of trauma over this. We have a document, and I'll be happy to send it to anybody who wants it, 200 signatures from clinical psychologists and developmental psychotherapists all across the country. We brought one to Wisconsin. You can watch his video at the website. His name is Dr. Gary Thompson, African-American father of 5. He's a clinical psychologist for kids. He's got one special needs daughter and one gifted daughter, and in his colorful language, they're both getting royally screwed over by Common Core. There is no room for either of those two girls. They don't fit. And he lambasted the committee about this. And there are 200 others that have signed the document. I want to show, and you can watch Gary's really compelling testimony online for free. But I want to show you one more. This is simply Dr. Mary Calamia. She's a clinical psychotherapist, social worker, caseworker from the state of New York. This is her testimony before the state of New York on what happened in New York, what she saw as a clinical psychotherapist, what she saw when Common Core was implemented. This is, and remember, New York has had this, the tests, had it for a couple more years. You're just getting there. Here's Dr. Mary. That's her testimony before the State Assembly.
I'm a licensed clinical social worker and I'm a psychotherapist. I work with parents, children, and that's my caseload is teachers also. My caseload represents about 20 different school districts in Suffolk County. In the fall of 2012, my phone started ringing. I started getting an inordinate number of referrals of students, a lot of honor students, 8th graders mostly, for self-mutilation. They were cutting themselves with sharp objects, and they were burning themselves with cigarettes. My phone never stopped. And I didn't know why. I asked the kids, and all they kept saying was, "We can't take the pressure, it's too much." I also started getting a lot of elementary school students referred to me. They were refusing to go to school. They said they felt stupid and that school was too hard. They were throwing tantrums, begging to stay home, and upset to the point of vomiting. I was hearing from parents about kids bringing home homework they couldn't help with. I was alarmed to hear that in some cases there were no textbooks for the parents to look at, and they had no idea that their children were learning. Teachers were reporting a staggering level of anxiety and depression, and that was when I first heard the term Common Core, and learned about the standards that we now say set the bar so high anyone can walk right under it. Everyone was talking about the tests. As the school year progressed and the tests loomed, when patients were increasing their self-mutilating behaviors, they were complaining of insomnia, panic attacks, loss of appetite, depressed mood, and in one case, suicidal thoughts that resulted in a 2-week hospital stay for an adolescent. We can't regulate biology. Young children cannot engage in the type of critical thinking that the Common Core calls for. That would require a fully developed prefrontal cortex, a part of the brain that is not fully functional until adulthood. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for critical thinking, rational decision-making, and abstract thought, all things that the Common Core requires prematurely. We give children pre-assessments, tell them to succeed, and then give them tests on material they haven't learned, and tell them it's okay to fail. They cannot resolve that mixed message. Last spring, a 6-year-old encountered a multiplication examination sign on the NWEA first grade math exam and asked the teacher what it was. The teacher was not allowed to help him and told him to just do his best. From that point on, the student's test performance went downhill. He couldn't shake off the unfamiliar symbol and couldn't believe his teacher wouldn't help him. The Common Core requires children to read informational texts that are owned by a handful of corporations. They don't have a filter to distinguish good information from bad, so whatever you put in front of them, they take that as gospel. They're literal. So when we give them a textbook that explains the Second Amendment as the people have the right to keep in their arms in a state militia, they will look no further for clarification. We ask them to write critically using emotionally charged language to persuade instead of inform. They don't have that functional prefrontal cortex, so they tap into their limbic system, which is the part of the brain that involves basic human emotions, anger and fear being the foremost. So when we ask them to use emotionally charged language, we're actually asking them to fuel their language with fear and anger and aggression. They cannot temper this judgment. They don't have the ability to do that. So we teach to the test, which I think doesn't really measure learning. I think the tests measure endurance and resilience. Only a child who can sit still for 90 minutes, come back the next day and do it again, and the next day again, can succeed. I'm going to introduce you to a couple, I'm almost done, I'm going to introduce you to just a couple of student stories, okay? A couple of faces of the Common Core. We have an entire third grade class that spent the entire day sobbing after one testing session. A second grader who witnessed this is now in third grade and won't go to school. She's being evaluated, a 7-year-old being evaluated for psychotropic medication just to get her to go to school. A 6-year-old who came home crying because in September, in the first grade, she didn't know what a vertex was. 2 8-year-olds opted out of the ELA exam and were publicly denied cookies because the teacher gave them to the class but wouldn't give them to them. And that teacher, who under duress, felt obligated to do such a thing. A 6th grader who once aspired to be a writer but now won't do it because we do it all day long, even in math. And a mother who has to leave work early because her son is hysterical over his math homework, and his CPA grandfather who's babysitting for him can't even help him do it. And countless other kids who are refusing to go to school feel stupid and now are completely turned off to education. I will conclude with this one thought. Our country became a superpower on the backs of men and women who learned in one-room schoolhouses. This isn't rocket science. It doesn't take a great deal of technology or corporate or government involvement to help our children to succeed. We need to rethink the Common Core and the associated high-stakes tests and get back to the business of educating our children in a safe, healthy, and productive manner. Thank you.
Way to go.
Okay, I'm going to wind this up in 2 seconds. I want to get you to the website I promised you. There's more things, but I think it's good enough for now. That's the website. We do not, just because I know this is a major concern, we don't make any money off this. You give us a click on the website to get this information. We're not getting a residual. We're not going to be hounding you with spam. That's such a critically important thing for people. So just bear that in mind. You can get anything I showed you here. If you want any information from me or any tracking of that down, I will give it to you. Do your own homework. I will simply say this by way of ending, okay? Number one, I'm going to take a lot of questions from you. Please, I can't help you with questions about, in our school we do it this way, or I teach Common Core math and I don't do it that way. I respect that. If you tell me it's true, I will believe you. But I can't do anything with that. I'm not coming here to tell you what's going on in your schools. That's not my job. I'm telling you, well, you just heard what I'm telling you, right? So I can't do anything with those questions. I will simply politely say to you, if you say so, because I don't know. So I can't help you with those questions. That's the first thing. The second thing I would say to you is, I want to make this clear. There has to be aspects of Common Core that do things better than have been done. There have to be. Something as complex, there has to be. In the same way that whatever you think of the healthcare law, there has to be something in it that is an improvement from what we had before. Does that justify everything else? Does that justify how we got it, who gave it to us, how they forced it on us? Does that justify everything you saw? And I understand this. I'm the one who said it. A good teacher can make the most out of a really bad curriculum, and a bad teacher can screw up the best one. Right? And I also said to you many times, Common Core is an extension. This is not new, most of this stuff. So the idea that Common Core somehow is the end-all and be-all of our problems, if you get rid of Common Core tomorrow, you're still going to have most of the same problems here. But in my estimation, the reason Common Core is dangerous, because if you don't stop it, you're not going to really be able to get rid of it from the ground up anymore. Once it becomes fully implemented, once it becomes fully funded, once you get all the national tests and assessments, once all this data starts to be gathered, if it's a big mistake, how do you pull out of it now? That's my big concern about it. Killing Common Core is not going to fix your problems. But it's a step that I think has to be taken if we're ever going to retain genuine local and state control of education. That's my view of it, okay? I thank you very, very much for listening to me tonight. Oh. And I very seriously encourage you to listen to anybody else you can on this topic. Get as many perspectives as you can. People who radically disagree with you, I urge you to go sit and listen to them politely. All right?